So you want to turbo your car, classic. You want to make a lot of cool noises. You want to make some power. You want to make a bunch of dudes think you're cool, and you want to be a boost creep. But there's so much to it. It can be so overwhelming. How do you pick a turbo? How do you know anything's going to work together? How do you keep your engine from blowing up? How do you keep stuff cool? And most importantly, how do you pick a turbo? Well, that's what we're doing today, baby. It's part 3 of the 6-part turbo saga. Today we're talking turbos.
A big holiday thank you to Ridge Wallets for sponsoring this episode. Anyone else feel like wallets are just becoming more like suitcases nowadays? Oh, my back! Oh! For sponsoring this episode. Anyone else feel?
Not today, Nolan!
My gift receipts, future Joe!
Nolan, it's 2020. No one needs gift receipts, and if you try to put that in your back pocket, you're gonna break your dang back. You won't even make it home for Christmas, let alone hear Santa's sleigh.
Ah, Santa's sleigh. People really did like that episode of Up to Speed.
Yes, they did. There's no reason to fact check that. Now, why don't you take this? The Ridge wallet doesn't fold or awkwardly bulge in your pockets. It's about carrying less while always having exactly what you need.
This is great. It's a bummer people have to wait till the future to get one.
Au contraire, Nolan, the future's here. All you gotta do is go to ridge.com/donut and use code DONUT to save 10%. But you gotta hurry because time is of the essence.
Wow, future Job, you've really saved us from a lot of painful scenarios. You deserve a break.
Maybe I do, Nolan. Maybe I do.
Thanks, Ridge Wallet.
All right, so this is the kit that we have. It's the CX Racing kit. Last week we installed the turbo manifold and we talked about downpipes, which means this week we're ready for the frickin' turbo itself, which is super exciting. But it's also a little daunting because there's a lot of stuff that goes into these and a lot of stuff to talk about. What are all these different numbers and sizes and measurements? Well, buckle up, babies, because we're gonna talk about it today. By the end of this episode, we're gonna have a turbo bolted to the Miata. So get ready, I'm excited. Here it is, the turbo we've all been waiting for. So we're gonna get into it, but first let's talk just briefly about how a turbo works. 2 sides to the turbo, the hot side and the cold side. The hot side is the side that deals with the exhaust, and the cold side is the side that deals with the fresh air being sucked in from the atmosphere and then crammed into your engine. Exhaust gases go through the turbine inlet here. They spin your little fan in there, and then the exhaust comes out here and back down the rest of your exhaust, out your tailpipe. Since these fan blades, these wheels, are mounted on a common shaft, when your exhaust spins the hot side, the cold side is also spun, and that sucks air in from the atmosphere, pressurizes it, and forces it into your engine. So that's really, in short, how a turbo works. It uses your exhaust to spin some fans to suck in and pressurize air and force it into your engine. Then over here we've got our wastegate. So the wastegate is basically the system that we use on a turbo to control boost, and this one is built to operate at 8 psi. So basically what happens, we will connect our wastegate to vacuum pressure, and then when we hit 8 psi of boost pressure, the spring in this wastegate will be overcome. It'll force this arm to actuate and open, and it opens a little flap in here which allows exhaust gases to bypass the turbo, effectively lowering boost pressure or controlling boost pressure. So now that we understand how a wastegate works and what it's doing, let's go ahead and take the turbine and the compressor housings off so we can get a better look at the fan blades and what the heck's going on in there. Okay, so when we're talking about turbo wheels like this, and this is our compressor wheel, there are basically 2 sides. There's the inducer and the exducer. The inducer is always going to be where the air comes in, and the exducer is going to be where the air exits. This turbo from CX Racing might be fine, but the fact is we don't have that much information. That's one of the big issues with cheaper quality parts. You don't necessarily get all the information that you get with a high quality part. So we're gonna go ahead and measure our fan blades here. We're gonna measure the inducer and the exducer. We've got about 58.5 millimeters there. And now let's move on to measuring the exducer side of the compressor wheel. And that's where the air exits. We got about 70 millimeters. So now let's yank off the turbine housing and get some measurements off of that wheel. And there's our turbine wheel and our turbine housing. So on the turbine wheel, the inducer and exducer are actually opposite of the compressor wheel. Again, it's all about where the air, or the exhaust gas, comes in and where it exits. And on the turbine side, it comes in at the big part of the blade and it exits at the small part of the blade. So we're gonna measure our inducer and exducer. Okay, about 65. Okay, well, 56. So now we've taken the measurements from our compressor and turbine wheels on the inducer and exducer sides. So that means we have 4 measurements total across both of our blades. But we can boil those 4 measurements down into 2. And those 2 measurements will kind of each characterize one of our wheels. And that's what's called trim. You may have heard of turbo trim before. And what that is basically describing one of your wheels. So we'll say our compressor wheel here. It describes the ratio of the inducer to the exducer. So the higher the trim number, generally speaking, the more air a wheel will flow. All right, so now that we understand a bit about our compressor and turbine wheels, how to measure them, what trim is, and what the size of your wheels means, let's talk about the housings they sit in, because they're pretty important. So these are our housings. This is our compressor housing, and this is our turbine housing. And the way these are measured is another measurement that you may have heard of when talking about turbo stuff. AR, which stands for area over radius. Now the AR rating of a housing is basically gonna be related to its ability to flow. We really don't pay too much attention to our compressor housings, but a turbine housing is absolutely critical for sizing the right turbo to your engine. Basically, the measurement of the turbine housing relates to how much exhaust gas can flow through it, which is super important in terms of making power the way you want to make power. We don't really need to know what the measurement is. What we need to know is that the larger an AR number for a housing, the more it can flow in terms of exhaust on the turbine side, or to some extent the compressor housing. But if you use a large turbine housing, that also will create lag. It takes time to spool up. A smaller turbine housing will create a quicker spool, a more responsive turbo. But since it can't flow as much exhaust, it can choke your engine out at higher RPMs when massive amounts of exhaust are trying to flow through this housing. So that's kind of the trade-off. But getting it right will make sure you have a turbo that does exactly what you want, whether that's massive peak horsepower and you're okay with some lag, or if that's a really responsive turbo at the cost of peak horsepower. And now my preference, generally speaking, especially for a street car like the old Miata, is to have a responsive turbo that's fun to drive, that has good low end, that doesn't necessarily make max peak horsepower, because that's really not where I spend most of my time on the streets, you know what I mean? Okay, let's talk about Compressor Maps briefly. It's one of the best tools to use to size a turbo to your engine. It basically gives you a plain look at how much air a turbo can flow. And we gotta talk about some fundamentals real quick before we look at a compressor map. It's all about airflow. Horsepower is about airflow. The more air you can flow through an engine, the more horsepower you can make. And obviously, that's what turbos are here for. They help us increase airflow. But turbos come in all sorts of different sizes, and they come in different airflows as such. But since horsepower is all about airflow, that's how turbos can be rated in horsepower. So when you're shopping for a turbo, you want to make sure that the displacement listed by the manufacturer for the engine and the horsepower range for that turbo match your goals. All right, so here is our compressor map. So let's talk about what we're looking at here. First off, the x-axis, corrected airflow in pounds per minute. Now, roughly speaking, 1 pound of airflow per minute can translate to about 10 horsepower at the crank. So here, where we see 20 pounds of airflow per minute, we can think of that as about 200 horsepower. If you want to make 500 horsepower, then you need to find a turbo that can handily flow 50 pounds per minute. Now, on the Miata, my power goals are about 225 wheel horsepower. So that means I need to make about 270 at the crank. So that means I'm looking for a turbo that can efficiently flow around 27 to 30 pounds of air per minute to meet my power goals. Now, the y-axis is our pressure ratio. This is kind of boost, but it's a little bit different in that it's a pressure ratio. It's just the ratio of the pressure in front of the compressor, like in the atmosphere, versus on the other side of the compressor, the boost side that's cramming air into your engine. Now, to understand that, we have to understand that the atmosphere that we are in all the time is about 14.7 psi. So in the case of the Miata and the turbo that I'm going to be running, we're going to start at 8 pounds of boost. That's what it's internally wastegated for, and we'll turn that up in the future. But for right now, we're going with 8 pounds of boost. So basically what we're going to do is add the boost that we're going to be making with our turbo to atmospheric air, and then the ratio is that number versus our atmospheric pressure. So that's where we're gonna land on our pressure ratio. We're running a pressure ratio of 1 to 1.55. Then we can determine whether or not that puts our turbo in an efficient area. All right, so let's see where this lands. At about 27 pounds of air flow per minute, at about 1.55 on our pressure ratio, that drops us right in over here. So basically what we're looking at here in the graph, this whole series of ovals, these are called efficiency islands. So we want to land in these efficiency islands to make sure that the turbo is operating in an efficient range. If it's not, then it's just going to be creating a bunch of heat and not power. So if we want to make the most power, we want to make sure we land our turbo in an efficient area. We can see that we do land in these efficiency islands. I think we're in the 65% range. Now, this has been a very brief look at compressor maps. If you want to go way deeper into them and learn a lot more about compressor maps, you got to go check out my dude Greg Peters at the Car Passion channel. He does a whole video all about compressor maps on a turbo Miata. It's really great. Now, with that all said, when you're actually shopping for a turbo, what you'll find is that pretty much all turbo manufacturers use a totally different naming convention. So the numbers that are attached to the name of a turbo for Garrett or Borg-Warner Precision, they're all going to be a little bit different, but they all in some way relate to the measurements that we've talked about here today. So all you got to do is go to their spec sheet and figure out what the numbers are actually related to. So let's get into it. Let's start getting our hands dirty and actually get a turbo mounted up to this nasty little. Well, didn't take long for me to run into my first hiccup. The first thing I wanted to do with getting the turbo installed was get oil pressure to the turbo, get that figured out. And you know, honestly, I went into it thinking no big deal, because one of the nice things about the 1994 Mazda Miata is that on the side of the block, right under the exhaust area, we've got a coolant port here and an oil port. But of course, the CX Racing kit doesn't take that port into account, so I don't have anything that's just gonna plug right into there. So I need to go from that in there to my oil feed line in, which is this NPT thread. So hopefully I can find a pretty chill little adapter to go from that to that. But I guess I gotta do some online shopping. But for right now, I'm gonna get the turbo manifold back on, and then we'll work on the oil return, because I know I can make that work. Oh, and the hits keep coming. Okay, so we had our little snafu with the oil pressure fitting that I'm gonna need to find. So I figured, no big deal, we'll just keep rolling. We'll just move on to the oil return. You see, with any turbo system, you need to get oil to the turbo, and then you need to return it to your oil sump. So in a situation like this, where we don't have an oil return for a turbo already, our turbo kit, the CX Racing kit, came with this little fitting. Basically, the idea is that we drill a hole in the side of our oil pan, then this goes in it, and then these two washers sandwich, help it not leak, tighten that down from the inside, and then you've got a return. A hose can go from your turbo right into this, and then this just sticks off the side of your oil pan. So I figured, no big deal, just yank the oil pan off and put this in. What I wasn't thinking of is that to take the oil pan out of a Miata, you have to lift the engine and drop the subframe. So I've got a little more work ahead of me than I was anticipating. We're gonna have to get the oil pan out to get this installed, and there's just no two ways about it. I'm just gonna have to do it. We'll see you tomorrow.
Hey friend, I know where you're at. You forgot to get a gift for the donut fan in your life, and it's too late for anything to be shipped. Well, you're in luck, because Donut Media gift cards are a thing. And you can get them in some phenomenal increments. I'm talking $25, $50, $75, $100, $150. And if you want to do something crazy like $7,500, give me a call and we'll work something out. The Donut Media gift cards are 100% digital. They don't rely on the old school guy on a horse delivering things, which is how I assume things still get to people. And each of them are designed after an 80s credit card, which is a genius idea that I came up with in literally 3 seconds. So head on over to donutmedia.com and pick up your perfect stocking stuffer today.
Okay, so we do finally have the oil pan out and we got our oil return installed on the oil pan. Now this location for the oil return will work in terms of where everything's at up here and my routing from the turbo to the oil pan. I hope. That was the plan. That's why I put it here. But the big question is, and one of the problems in my opinion of this return style that has a nut on the inside as opposed to a threaded style, is that now there's this big nut on the inside. So I am gonna put the oil pan on without any sealer and spin the engine by hand just to make sure this doesn't hit the crankshaft or the bottom of the connecting rods or anything, because if it does, that's a pretty big problem. And I'll have to move this somewhere else. I didn't really think about that before I did this, but hey, here we are now. The good news is I do have a backup oil pan should I need one, so it'll be okay. All right, so we just got done checking clearance of our oil return, and the good news is we're good. It'll be fine there. I do need to make a little hole in the windage tray that drops in here so it doesn't interfere with that, but it looks like this return spot will work. Exquisite. Okay, so now that means we're pretty much ready to put some sealant on this oil pan and put it back up in, and put the subframe up in and get back to the turbo. All right, we've got the oil return line finally installed in the oil pan and it's ready to be plumbed up. So now I'm just putting the turbo onto the turbo manifold, which is huge news, very exciting. And then once we've got it bolted to the manifold, we will plumb up our return line. Making big steps, baby. That was the sound of piston number 4 coming out the side. The best thing about problems is figuring out how to solve them. Well, sometimes getting turbo hardware into place is tough because, well, it leaves you in kind of tight spots trying to get hardware in and then trying to get a wrench on that hardware to tighten it. So, like on this specific nut in there, I can't get a wrench in there. So I'm just tightening it from below and I'm using the screwdriver to keep the nut from spinning. So this is my screwdriver wrench. Pretty sweet wrench. All right, the turbo is tight. That is great news. So now with it in place, we're ready to trim up our oil return line and get it attached to the turbo. So to do this, basically the big thing you want to make sure of is that there are no hard turns or bends or kinks in your return line. So that obviously comes into play when you're choosing where to put it on your oil pan, but it also comes into play when you're routing the hosing. So I've got it going down through the lower coolant hose, and a couple other things down here, and it honestly looks really good. It's a nice straight shot to the nipple down in the oil pan. So now I'm just going to trim it so we got a nice straight return line. Okay, so another thing to make sure of when you're setting up your turbo and all your lines is that the oil feed and especially the oil return stay pretty well vertical as far as their orientation is concerned. So you can rotate the center housing, the rotating assembly in there any which way you like, but if you rotate it too far either way, it's going to have a hard time draining the oil, and that's not what you want. If your turbo has a hard time draining oil or oil gets backed up, it'll start coming out the seals, start making smoke, and just not be a good time. So you want to make sure that your oil drain is pretty close to vertical. I think they say like 15 degrees either way is okay, but I just try to keep it straight up and down. Okay, so the turbo's in place and our oil return line is looking nice. It's nicely plumbed up. So now I think it's time to see if this downpipe fits. We talked about it last week, but now with the turbo in place, we can actually install it. So let's see how it goes. Well, that's good news. I mean, hey, it's in the right ballpark. Now, so these are V-band clamps. These are great exhaust unions, I guess you could call them. So we just use this little clamp. All right, so the downpipe is roughly in place. The great news is that it seems to fit pretty well. It's in there where it belongs. It is pretty close to some stuff like our coolant line for the heater core. We do have a little air gap now, but that said, this downpipe is going to be super hot, and I really should and eventually will put some exhaust wrap on it to try to contain some of this heat. Same thing with the turbo manifold. Absolutely not a bad idea to exhaust wrap that to try to contain the heat, and keep it in your turbo rather than in your engine bay. But for now, I think it's going to be okay. Now I'm ready to go underneath and see if this thing fits up. So this is the intermediate pipe that goes from the downpipe to our stock exhaust. Yo, pretty close. Got a little flex pipe here. This is gonna be just fine. All right, well, this is great. I just gotta get the V-band clamp on here, get some nuts on this end, and wowee, the hot side is done. The manifold's on, the turbo's on, it's plumbed up, and now we've got a downpipe and intermediate pipe connecting to the exhaust that goes all the way out the back. It's really shaping up. All right, so we got a turbo installed on this Miata, and that's awesome. But before we go, let's talk about one other thing, one of my favorite combinations of words in the English language, and a set of words that just popped into my head because I forgot to bring it up earlier. Shaft play. So depending on whether or not you got a journal bearing turbo or a ball bearing turbo kind of will dictate how shaft play should feel. So first off, you've got the up and down shaft play or radial shaft play. So that's trying to wiggle it up and down in its little home in there. And then there's end play or axial play. So trying to push the shaft this way as opposed to this way. So because this shaft rides on a thin film of oil, there's always gonna be a little bit of up and down play on the shaft of a journal bearing turbo. This one's brand new and you can feel a little bit of play. Now that's totally normal. When the engine's running, there's oil pressure in there that stiffens that puppy right up. The only problem is you can't really get your hand in there to wiggle it when it's running. Now, if this were a ball bearing turbo and there were that much up and down play, that would be a problem. A ball bearing turbo all the time should have very little up and down play. Now, what you really want to pay attention to on a journal bearing turbo and a ball bearing turbo is end play. So if you can move the shaft in and out this way, you got a problem. Luckily, we can't. So that's what you're looking for when you're talking about shaft play. There's up and down and there's end to end. So now that I've gotten away with saying shaft play on YouTube a few times, I think that's really gonna do it for this week, and what a week it's been. There is finally a friggin' turbo on the Miata. I know you guys have been excited for this day, and I have too, and it's finally here. We've got the engine compression tested and leak down tested. We did the manifold, we did the turbo, and now the downpipe's on as well. So next week, you gotta check back, because we're gonna get into the cold side. We're gonna do all the intercooler piping, the intercooler itself, and the blow-off valve. So don't forget to follow me at Zach Job and follow Donut at Donut Media. And I'll see you guys here next week for some blow-off valve noises. No, I can't say that because we're not gonna get noises next week either. What? No, that doesn't work. Don't use that. No!